Remember Donkey Kong Country? I know I do. I remember Donkey Kong Country a little differently than some people. Well, I mean, maybe you remember it the same way as me, and if so, that's weird. But I remember Donkey Kong Country because I used to force my dad to drive me down. I mean, almost every week. And he wanted to go for a ride, so sure, why not? So almost every single day before the game launched, we would go down to Toys R Us, and we would sit, I'd stand there, and in all my glory on this tiny little 19-inch monitor, I'd be able to play Donkey Kong Country, at least the first 2 levels, on the demo unit that they had that was sitting there in the system there. And I just was like blown away at the graphics, and just amazed at the level of detail in the game. And I wasn't that big of a Donkey Kong fan. I mean, I'd played Donkey Kong, like, the arcade game, and Donkey Kong 3. I remember playing that in my orthodontist room, but before we would go in for the appointments, it'd be there and be like, oh, look at this, and you'd look at Space Invaders and be like, oh, look at that. So I remember that stuff, but Donkey Kong Country was a huge deal. I mean, I remember watching the video for Donkey Kong Country, the tape that Nintendo Power sent with your subscription, and they sent this tape, and I seriously watched it like, oh my god, I can't even remember. I must have worn down the tape, like, seriously, a million bazillion times. And I would watch it and get so pumped and so psyched, and I'd go to Toys R Us and I'd play the first couple levels, and I just loved the game. It was awesome. It was so great, and such a nice fresh change of pace for platformers. I mean, platformers really kind of were going downhill, and I mean, you had Mario, you had Sonic, but for Nintendo, platformers were kind of getting a little stale. A lot of the mascots that were coming out, they really weren't fresh, they weren't unique, they weren't fun. And between Donkey Kong Country and Mario, like Yoshi's Island 2, and those like late Super Nintendo, like 95, 96 games, those were just amazing. I mean, those were some fantastic games that came out back then. Donkey Kong Country. I was like crazy for Donkey Kong Country. I mean, I had the Donkey Kong Country green t-shirt that was like the dot matrix printer printed it out with that picture of Donkey Kong, this huge giant picture. And I remember wearing that like all the time, and I got made fun of so much in middle school. And it was just, I mean, I look back on it now. I remember doing a report on Donkey Kong Country. I don't even remember what it was for. It was like some sort of report for English or something. And I brought in like this CD of like the Donkey Kong music that I had, that like I bought, like I remember I went crazy for those Nintendo Power subscription like little manuals that had like the stuff you could buy for Donkey Kong Country. I had a Donkey Kong little like squeeze toy figure thing. I had the Diddy Kong one. I had the shirt, as said before. I had the Donkey Kong Country soundtrack. I mean, I was a little Donkey Kong nut. Yeah, I was a little crazy. But it was fun, and it was a great time in my life. And even though, it was that awkward phase in middle school, I was like, oh, I like girls. And then I was like, oh, I like video games too. And I was just like, oh, I'm a weird guy. I just really, I mean, Donkey Kong Country got me through 6th grade. That and, basketball, Mortal Kombat, and yeah, it was good times. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Hope you enjoyed this episode of the show that I do that talks to you about nostalgia and fun stuff. So, bye!